We've been working through a letter in the New Testament of the Bible. It's called 1 Corinthians. It's written by Paul, who's an early church leader. He had a very transformational experience with Jesus, with the risen Jesus, according to his story, his claim. And so as a result of that, he starts taking the message of Jesus throughout the Roman Empire in the first century. And so he's going in new places, and one of those places he lands is ancient Greece, in the city of Corinth specifically. He spends a couple years there and starts a church, and then he moves on, and over the next couple of years, the people in Corinth, they still stay in communication through messengers at that point in time in history, and so they have some questions and need some clarifications. Paul has some concerns, and so he writes this letter, which is one of several letters of correspondence, to kind of address some of their questions and issues. We've been working through it because there are some challenges in their culture that are very different from the way that Jesus lives his life. And if we look at our culture, there are some ways that our culture operates that are very different from the way that Jesus operates as well. And so having challenges with our culture driving us one way and Jesus' example driving us a different way, that's not something that's unfamiliar to us either. So we've been trying to learn some things from this letter to the ancient Corinth, to the church that's there as well. And just to recap, we're almost to the end of this letter. We're in chapter 16 today, which is the last chapter of the letter. And last week we were in chapter 15, and Paul was dealing with the resurrection of Jesus and why that's something that is an important thing, not just for the church to believe in and embrace, but for followers of Jesus to anticipate themselves experiencing one day as well. Gives us a lot of hope. It tells us that there's something beyond this life and something that may be more familiar than what we actually think. And so here's a quick recap of what we talked about last week. If you want to look at our series online, we have a link on our website to the YouTube channel that has other messages on that. But essentially, last week, we talked about the fact that in the resurrection, our bodies are going to be remade in the image of Jesus, who in his resurrection, he takes on what we might consider to be the final form of humanity. But then last week, we talked about the question of when that resurrection will take place. And Paul, he doesn't really get into a specific exact timing about that. He recognizes, to some extent that's a mystery. But he realizes two things. And the first thing is that it's going to happen suddenly. Both the resurrection of those who have died and the transformation of those who are following Jesus, who are alive at that point in time. It's going to be something that takes place, according to Paul, just in a moment, in a blink of an eye or a fraction of a second. But it's not also going to be something that, according to Paul, catches people off guard. It's going to be announced in some way, and he uses the metaphor of a trumpet to kind of portray that, because trumpets in the ancient world were used to announce assemblies and celebrations and to give armies direction in battle and things like that. And so there's some kind of a forewarning or announcement that seems to coincide with some of God's future plans. Things that Isaiah in the Old Testament, when he mentions of this resurrection, mentions things like God becoming a refuge for the poor and the weak, and God finally silencing violence once and for all. And we realize that hasn't happened yet. Preparing a feast for the nations to be invited into, and rescuing God's people and defeating the source of chaos and deception in the world. And all those things are things that haven't been accomplished yet. But Isaiah and the Apostle Paul seem to correlate the timing of Jesus' resurrection, spoken of the resurrection of Jesus' followers, with some of those events that we still haven't experienced in the world today. Again, that's, I think, from Paul's perspective, kind of what he's presenting concerning Jesus' resurrection. But ultimately, Paul's main concern is not the timing, it's the reality of Jesus' resurrection and the reality of ours. Because Paul believes that God has plans more than just our experience in this life and then it's over, our existence is just erased. Paul doesn't see that way. He sees that God has plans beyond our just mortal life and existence here and now. And because of that, pouring our time and our attention and our resources into doing God's work, it's worthwhile. It's not vain. Making sacrifices to benefit other people instead of just living for ourselves, that's not something that's worthless. Which, if there was nothing beyond this life, you probably could make a pretty good argument that that's just worthless, making sacrifices for others. I mean, just enjoy life yourself, protect your own life, and live it out as best as possible. But Paul says we don't have to think that way because of the resurrection. Putting other people's well-being above ours, that's something that's always going to be worthwhile. And so Paul uses that to segue into what we're talking about today. And since he's telling the Corinthians, since your work in God is not in vain, then here's a need that you can give to generously. Here's something that you can pour your resources into, right? That's going to be benefiting other people, and it's going to be a little sacrificial for you. And that's a need that the Jerusalem Christians at this point in time, and again, we're reading about a church in ancient Corinth, Greece, which is about 18 or 1900 miles away from Jerusalem in the ancient world. That's a pretty good drive for us, but if you're on foot, that's a pretty good hike, right? 1800 miles. And so to care about people 1800 miles to the east of you, that's a significant thing and a sacrifice. But Paul says, let's focus our attention and our resources on this other group of believers, these other followers of Jesus that happen to be a different place. And so we're going to look at that story today. We're just going to look at two verses in 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2, because we have to look at two other places, the letter of Romans and then the letter of 2 Corinthians, the second letter we have to this Corinthian church later, about a year later or so, to figure out the rest of the story. So we're going to put the pieces of the puzzle of this project, this giving project together using a couple other verses from a couple other places. But that's what we're looking at this morning. And I want to cover one kind of important Bible word phrase today, and that's the word saints. It's used in a lot of different ways. It's an NFL team, right, out of New Orleans, and it's something where if you're super spiritual and you're memorialized forever in a religion, maybe you become a saint. But in the Bible, it's a much more general term, and it just means God's people in general who have devoted themselves by faith to carry out God's purposes in the world. And so if that's you, then you're a saint from the Bible's point of view and from this letter of Paul's point of view. And Paul's thought, too, is if you are one of these people who has come to follow God and carry out his purposes, then you deserve to be honored for that. And so Paul's going to use that to encourage believers in Greece, followers of Jesus in Greece, to also take care of some very impoverished followers of Jesus back in the city of Jerusalem. He's going to use that as some motivation. So let's go ahead and jump into this morning. And we're going to look at guidelines for giving, but two specific guidelines. It's going to be a little bit more broad. If you were writing guidelines for giving, you probably wouldn't write these 4 guidelines. But this is how Paul presents giving, and I think it's a very healthy approach to giving. We're going to look specifically at financial giving this morning and next week, but it also broadens out beyond that because there's a lot of different ways that you can give to people beyond money. And so that's going to be a focus, but just know that giving is a broader thing. And so the first thing that Paul wants the ancient Corinthians to do, and I think that we can learn from too, to consider when we're thinking about this topic of giving, is considering the partnership. The partnership that we have with God and with people, it really motivates our giving in a lot of essential ways. And Paul introduces this concept this way. He says, now about the collection for the saints. So they're going to take up an offering or a collection at some point in the future. But Paul is kind of fleshing out the details of this in his first letter to the Corinthians, and then we have to go to his letter to the Romans and his second letter to the Corinthians to figure out the details of what this looks like. What are the details of this collection? And so we're going to skip around a little bit to figure that out. So in Romans 15, Paul's referring back to this collection. He says, right now, I'm traveling to Jerusalem to serve the saints. So he's already collected the money at this point. Because Macedonia and Achaia, which are they're two different geographic areas of ancient Greece. Okay, so he's saying Greece. Those people, they were pleased to make a contribution. But the word he uses for contribution, it's not like a financial gift. It's the word partnership. And so Paul is saying it wasn't necessarily just that they were thinking of this in terms of a financial gift. They were thinking of it in terms of how can we partner with other people who have needs. For the poor among the saints in Jerusalem, there's that word saints again, right? Just these followers of Jesus who have committed their lives to God's values and furthering those purposes. So a couple things from this. Followers of Jesus in ancient Greece view Jerusalem Christians as family members. It's a partnership. And that's how this concept of the church, the followers of Jesus, what it really looks like, what it looked like then and what it looks like today. It's this community of people who are connected by mutual faith in Jesus, but they see each other as more than just friends. Like, this is family. We have a partnership, a deep connection. And that's why they're going to want to give, because they see that partnership. Second thing here, they especially have compassion for those who have been reduced to poverty, and specifically people in the church, this community of followers of Jesus in Jerusalem. But they have this compassion. And so compassion is another thing that drives their heart and furthers that partnership. Verse 27 in Romans 15 gives us a little bit more. It says, yes, they were pleased and indeed are indebted to them, for if the nations have shared in their spiritual benefits, then they are obligated to minister to them in material needs. And so Paul is just kind of summarizing what's happened. The church started in Jerusalem. Jesus' followers and the people who saw him after his resurrection, they were in that area of Jerusalem. And then they spread out and carried that message of Jesus to other places in the Roman Empire. And so Paul's saying, you all benefited from those Christians in Jerusalem, ultimately, because they're the ones that brought the message out this way to ancient Corinth. And so that's something that they benefited from. So they contributed spiritually to you, but you have an opportunity to contribute materially to them by providing for them as they're going through this season of poverty and of a lack of material goods. And so a part of the partnership that we should consider as followers of Jesus is not just the financial side, but maybe there's other contributions people make. People have invested time in our lives, or people have made spiritual contributions in our lives. They have taught us things that are important. They have taken on burdens for us. They've prayed for us. And so it's not just about giving in a financial sense. It's about considering how we're giving to one another and trying to even out things and to meet each other's needs, regardless of what kinds of needs those are. And it just so happens that the needs in the Jerusalem church at this point in time are very materially focused. They need food, shelter, clothing, the basic essentials at this point in time. And so this church, the churches in Greece, they actually feel obligated to repay those spiritual contributions that have been given years before from the church in Jerusalem with some material provisions. And so that's a valid thing to feel, to want to do. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit in 2 Corinthians. It's the same point in time, similar point in time as to when Romans 15 was written, but it's, again, a year or more after what we're reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And so here, Paul's talking to the Corinthians later on. He says, we want you to know, brothers and sisters, about the grace of God that was given to the churches of Macedonia. So Corinth is in Achaia in central Greece. Macedonia is in northeastern ancient Greece. And so he's talking to the Corinthians about the people in another section of ancient Greece. And he says, God's grace was given to those churches that are not too far away from you in Greece during a severe trial brought about by affliction. And he doesn't go into details, but he says, your neighbors in Greece, they were really suffering in some way. He says, in the midst of that, their abundant joy and their extreme poverty overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So even though the people in northern Greece were going through their own struggles with poverty, they really wanted to give to meet the needs of the people in this church in Jerusalem who were also experiencing poverty. I think it's interesting sometimes some of the people who are the most generous are the people who have the least, because they know what it's like to experience want and lack. And I think the more we have, sometimes the more distant we get from connecting with the needs of other people. But if we've been through a time personally where we've really been in need, we tend to see other people's needs and we identify with that and we want to help. And that's what was happening in some of these Christians' hearts. He says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, for your sake he became poor so that by his poverty you might become rich. So Paul's saying in a similar way, Jesus also, he impoverished himself to take on humanity, to come into this world and ultimately to not only interact with people and their insults and misunderstandings for years, but also to take the sins of humanity onto himself and to give his life as a sacrifice, as a way to repair people's broken relationship with God and restore that, bring people back into a relationship with God again. And so Jesus impoverished himself to meet the needs of us. And so he's telling the churches in ancient Greece, maybe you should give some of what you have, like Jesus gave up some of what he had to meet the needs of other people who are impoverished, just like Jesus met the needs of you. So they want to imitate God's undeserved kindness, which in a time of suffering overflowed in a wealth of generosity at Jesus' expense. And so when we look at partnership, we're also thinking, how can I imitate Jesus' example, how he gave to me in the way that I give to other people? And it's not just something that's a partnership with people, it's a partnership actually with Jesus himself when we give. And there's this idea present in the early church that I think we ourselves, myself included, I can also learn from this because I don't necessarily view my possessions this way a lot. I forget about this. But in the early church, a lot of followers of Jesus, they have this idea that their possessions, like all of them, they ultimately belong to the Lord. They're God's possessions, and they're just kind of entrusted with them. And we see things like this come out in the early chapters of Acts in the New Testament, describing some of what's happening in the early church. In that book, it's written, now all the believers were together and held all things in common. So they essentially had all these resources, but they realized these resources aren't ours. They're not ours individually, they're ours collectively. It says they sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke bread from house to house. And so they're looking after each other's material needs, spiritual needs, and then they're eating together in different houses as people have possessions. And so it's a very much a communal way of existence. And in America, in 21st century America, it's very individualized, right? What's mine is mine, and I worked hard for it, and I'll share it if I want to, but it's not yours. And the early church has a very different mindset when it comes to possessions. This is something that carried on at least a couple hundred years into the church experience. There's a Christian leader named Irenaeus who's writing about 150 years after this point. And this is what he's writing about what Christians think in the 2nd century. He says, Christians who have liberty or freedom, which they do, they have certain freedoms, assign all their possessions to the Lord, bestowing freely not the lesser portions of their property, since they have the hope of greater things. Let's just sit on that for a second. So, first of all, that same idea of my possessions belong to God, ultimately, the things I have, the resources, the finances, material stuff, belongs to the Lord. And so because it belongs to the Lord, they're going to give freely. But they're not giving the lesser portion of their property. So think about, like, what would the lesser portion be? Like maybe what, like 30, 40%, right? They're giving a lot of what they have, like he would say the greater portion of what they have, because their hope is in greater things than just accumulating stuff. And I think that's a challenging way to think, to see our possessions as God's when we think about the partnership of giving. The last thing on this first point is in 2 Corinthians 8, verses 3 and 4. And Paul's writing, again, this is future, a second letter beyond 1 Corinthians. Paul says, I can testify that according to their ability and even beyond their ability, of their own accord. So there's some things we'll talk about next week related to that, like the portion, the amount of their giving. There's some wisdom Paul gives concerning that, but we'll wait till next week to talk about that. But it's free will. They begged us earnestly for the privilege of sharing and attending to the needs of the saints. And so even some of these impoverished Christians in Greece are begging Paul, like, we want to be a part of this. We know these Christians have a lot of material needs in Jerusalem, like they're impoverished, and please let us be a part of the privilege of attending to these needs of God's people. And so that's their attitude toward giving. Giving is very much a partnership, and they consider it a privilege to be involved with that. So let's kind of go from that ancient world to our world today. And I think a valid question for us to think about and consider in respect to our giving is, what are the needs of God's people in this place? And maybe the bulk of people here are not experiencing a time of extreme poverty, but maybe some of the followers of Jesus here in this community are experiencing times of poverty. I mean, inflation is on the rise. Housing costs are ridiculous and very unachievable, especially for people just starting off their years of employment or people with young families. It can be a very difficult place to live. And so food and shelter and clothing are very real needs for people, even some people in our local Christian community here. So that's something to be aware of. And then we have kind of a larger catalog of what we might say could be needs. And we have to think in terms of our culture when we think about this question. What are the needs of God's people in this place? Do we, in our time and place, do we need a well-maintained building and grounds? Do we as a church need that? And I'm not going to tell you the answer to that question. We happen to have something like that currently, but it's only because we continue to invest in that, right? If we just take our hands off, everything goes awry really fast, right? And so is having a place that can be available to this church community and our local community where we can invite people into it and have lots of things happening throughout the week, is that valuable? Is that a need in this particular community? Do we need water and electricity and trash pickup? Do we need that? I'm not telling you the answer. I'm telling you things we need to think about in terms of our giving. What do we need? Do we need a paid pastor? Is that something that we need at this time and place? In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul talks about how he didn't receive any money for the ministry that he was doing. And that's a complex issue because there was a thing called patronage in the Roman Empire, which came with it came expectations. And so the idea is, if you exist in a community and a wealthy person or group of people, they sponsor you, they pay you, they provide for your needs, whether it's in the community, in a business, in a church, in a whatever, then that person now owes you something. And if you don't like what they're saying or what they're doing, all you have to do is kind of snap your finger and call them over for a quick conversation, and they'll make changes to make you happy because you're their sponsor. And Paul said, I'm not going to take that on because I don't want anyone in this particular local church thinking that they have authority to tell me what I can say and what I can't say. Because I'm here to bring a message from God, and I feel like that would compromise that. And we know from this letter that several of the Corinthians have some ideas that Paul feels are very unlike Jesus and very concerning. So he knows that would be a conflict of interest for him. So it's a complex issue why Paul decides to deny that, reject financial compensation. But he mentions that some of the apostles and some of the other church leaders in other parts of the world are okay with taking that. And so is that something we need? Do we need music on Sunday mornings? Do we need kids programs and youth programs? Do we need Bible studies? Do we need prayer teams? Do we need transportation and equipment in order to be effective here? Do we need an online presence? Do we need special events and family camps and these things? Those are questions that we have to address because we may have needs of those things in our day. And that's something that we have to determine as local church communities, right? What's worth investing in? What does our community need in our time and place? And we have conversations about that throughout the year. It's something where anyone is invited into that input because every year we determine budgets and we determine where spending is going to go. And we can always navigate that, right? We can always make adjustments, cut things out, add things in to figure out what our church needs are in this day and age. But it's a very valid question for us to consider. And then we can consider things about like what God's people in other places need as well. And that's what the early church in Corinth was doing. They're thinking about Christians 1,800 miles away in Jerusalem. And so that brings us into a more global kind of conversation. What do God's people in other places, other parts of the United States need, other parts of the world need? Do they need messengers? Do they need food and clothing and shelter? Do they need clean water? Do they need transportation? Do they need training? Do they need facilities? Do they need medical care? Do they need materials? Do they need prayer? And so it broadens our question, but how can we partner beyond just our local church? And then Jesus even invites us to consider how that affects our local communities, beyond the church community, beyond the group of people seeking to follow Jesus in our local area, in our world. What about the others? Jesus talks about charitable giving. He talks about loving our neighbors. He talks about loving our enemies. And doing that as expressions of our sincere devotion to God, but also as an avenue to being a light to the world around us. And so our partnership, our giving, can extend beyond just the people following Jesus to our community as well. And so we're trying to do that and foster that in different ways, even here locally, by making things available to address people's needs. But Paul would say, look at giving as a partnership. Last thing that I want to end on today is just a little bit of the pattern of what giving looks like in the ancient Corinthian church. I think we can learn from it, but I don't think it's something that we need to be tied into. I think it's more of a point of wisdom for us, something for us to consider. He says, do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. So he's been giving a lot of churches in different parts of the Roman world who are giving to the churches in Jerusalem some similar advice. He says, on the first day of the week, each of you is to set something aside and save. And so that's their little protocol at that point in time. On the first day of the week, set something aside to save it. And so Paul is encouraging a really practical approach here. He's telling everybody who's willing to consistently set something aside to give on the day the church gathers. The first day of the week is the day that the early church is meeting. But why is he constructing things that way? Why are the early Christians gathering for worship on the first day of the week? The Jews gathered on the Sabbath, on Saturday, the seventh day. Any of you have an idea of why the church might be meeting on the first day of the week instead of on the seventh? Something really important happened on the first day of the week. Yeah.
Resurrection.
Yeah, Paul just finished. Chapter 15 was Paul talking about the resurrection, and it's kind of a nice little tie-in. When Jesus came back to life on the third day, it happened to be on the first day of the week. And so the early church started meeting in celebration of Jesus' resurrection on the first day of the week. That's part of it. But also, why does it matter that they're setting something aside on that day? A few things. First of all, as we mentioned, it's the day the church is meeting. And so part of it is they're supposed to connect giving, I think, with worship, right? It's just another extension of you gathering as a church. It's you setting something aside. It's a part of your worship experience. But the first day of the week, it also has a tie into the resurrection, but it's almost like we're participating in it. Because when Jesus came back to life, he came back to life to fuel this kind of eternal set of values. And even though our world has still gone awry in a lot of ways, and we still wrestle with our human wisdom and the way that God maybe would direct us to live in light of his resurrection, but we can begin to live in that light, where we don't just hoard our possessions and where we look and we try to put other people above ourselves. And so we can walk in aspects of Jesus' resurrection here and now, and I think that's a part of it. Another thing, which is not necessarily obvious, but if you read the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, and at the end of each day, you see some phrase like evening and morning, it was the so-and-so day, first day, second day, third day. But when you get to the seventh day, there is no evening and morning. And it's almost this concept where when God made everything and he made everything good, his intention was for things to continue in that trajectory. And then people made some choices that took things off trajectory really fast. But it's almost this idea that when we're giving and we're partnering with other people, we're participating in this ultimate new creation. This kind of eighth day or first day of the week that just never ends. It never has an end to it. And so all those things are supposed to maybe be linked with the first day of the week. Also, it's a good routine, right? It's easy to remember. The first day of the week, the day you all gather for your church gatherings, for worship, that's the day you set things aside. And in the ancient Roman world, it's flexible enough to fit a variety of pay schedules. Some people get paid daily. A lot of just basic laborers get some type of coin at the end of the day. Other jobs pay more consistently, maybe weekly or monthly. And then if you're a soldier, for example, or some occupations, they pay about 3 times a year. And so Paul's not telling everyone to do this. He gets into details after this, and it shows that it's a willingness. There has to be willingness. But it's not everybody has to do this all the time. It's those who are able to and who want to do this. How about you fit it into the first day of the week? It's routine. And also they're saving individually, which is very different than the way things work here at Mountain View and in a lot of current churches. They're not taking weekly collections. They're just setting something aside. And then when this offering is supposed to eventually be distributed, people are going to show up and they're going to bring what they've been collecting personally and setting aside, and they're going to give it to the messengers who are going to deliver it. Why do things operate that way? Well, a couple things. First of all, in this culture, one of the fastest ways to gain status and honor and recognition is by making a public donation. And so if you're setting aside things privately, it's going to be more sincere giving. instead of stuff that's just meant to elevate you. So maybe part of it has to do with your attitude and your motives. But also, it's really challenging to protect large sums of money in the ancient world. And ancient temples actually serve as the banks most of the time in the ancient world. And they have treasuries and they have resources and they have guards, but local house churches don't have any of that. And so probably the easiest way to get a bunch of money stolen is to keep it in one place that's not very well secured. And so this is a way of just ensuring the safety of all that as well. So it's very practically driven, how they're doing things. We'll talk about how we do things in just a moment as we wrap up. A couple more things about the pattern. He says, now concerning the ministry to the saints, the service to the saints, it's unnecessary for me to write you, for I know your eagerness, and I boast about you to the Macedonians. That's the other section of Greece. Achaia, which is where Corinth is, has been ready since last year, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. So this is not Paul twisting arms to get them to give. Paul explains that giving has been a personal choice. It's been something that they've been zealous to do. It's been inspiring to other people, but it's been a personal choice. And so it's not an expectation. Maybe you've been a part of different churches or religious organizations where it's kind of just this unwritten rule, or maybe it's a written one. It's an expectation. You're just going to give. Well, from a Bible perspective, at least in the early church, and from our practice here at Mountain View, your giving is between you and the Lord, and there's never an expectation. It's always something that you personally choose. It's a personal choice if you choose, if you want to do that. It should be something that you can be excited about and celebrate, not something that's coerced. Which kind of leads us into our last comment here this morning. He says, but I'm sending the brothers that are boasting about you in this matter. Sending the brothers so that our boasting in this matter would not prove empty, and so that you would be ready, just as I said. So there's going to, again, be people that are arriving to collect this money and take it all the way over to Jerusalem. We'll talk about that next week a little bit more. He says, otherwise, if any of the Macedonians come with me and find you unprepared, we, not to mention you, be put to shame in that situation. So he's just saying, I want you to be prepared, because the Macedonians, they've made more sacrifices than you to give, and they were inspired by you. So if they show up, some of their contingency to carry this money to Jerusalem, and you're not prepared to give, and you're the ones that inspired them to give, your zeal and your commitment, then it's going to backfire. It's going to cause you to feel ashamed. And he's saying, I don't want that. Rather, he says, I consider it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and to arrange in advance the generous gift you promised, so that it'll be ready as a gift and not as an extortion. So he's just talking about the planning. He wants to ensure that their giving is planned and not pressured by expectations or greed. And I want to just encourage you, don't ever give because you feel pressured to give, because you feel like someone expects you to give, because you feel like somebody around you is watching you, whether or not you will give. Give because you plan to give and you want to give, not because you feel expected to give. And at the same time, we have to be careful on the other end, not to let our giving be taken off track by greed. Because sometimes an opportunity to give shows up and we're excited about it, and then we think, well, I really could use that for something else. So maybe we'll just next time, we'll just hold off and put that money towards something that I would rather have instead of these needs of other people. So make sure that giving is planned. And when you plan, if you really believe that's what you want to do as an act of partnership, follow through and don't let last minute pressure cause you to deviate one way or the other from that. Again, I think that would be Paul's advice to us today. And giving has changed throughout history. Financial giving has. In the Old Testament of the Bible, it kind of took the form of there was a treasury and there were receptacles at the temple in Jerusalem, and people would bring their tithes or their taxes or their offerings to that. That changed a little bit over time to becoming small offering boxes as well at local synagogues for local needs, Jewish places of worship. And then in the early church, they would bring things to the church leaders to have it distributed. And then on throughout later church history, in the Middle Ages, it was often a combination of different states or governments were supplying some of church's needs, and then donations were supplying other church needs. And then the church at different points in time in history had land holdings. And so they were farming land and using produce and the earnings from the land to help fund churches. And then in the 1500s to 1800s, things kind of shifted away, and it became more of a state-sponsored church where different governments were footing the entire bill for many churches. And then in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries or so, things kind of changed again, more toward a pass the plate kind of concept where different churches were collecting, giving locally. And here, things are kind of a combination of that. There are bags that are passed around each week, not because you're supposed to give, but for people who want to and who have planned to. We have a box in our auditorium, in our lobby out here in the entryway, and then we have online giving platforms. And most churches today are switching to online giving almost exclusively. And so that's kind of the way that giving has changed over time, and I think continues to change over time. And so, our process, it might look different than it did in ancient Corinth, but we can still learn some things. Our giving needs to be practical, needs to be personal, so it's something we choose, not something that is dictated. And I think it needs to be planned so that we're not pressured into giving when we partner with God and with his community of followers to meet needs that we see, to meet each other's needs oftentimes. And so that's kind of how giving works out here. It takes on a lot of different forms: time, service, education, prayers, supplies, finances, etc. And if you determine that the needs that have been determined at this point for this local church is something that you want to be a part of through financial giving, again, there's different avenues. There's personal ways, there's online ways that you can contribute. There's a QR code on the back of the bulletin, even if you want to use that to access online giving. But it's not something that's pressured. It's something that you should be doing because you want to partner in the things that are perceived as needs, in this local community or in other Christian communities today or beyond that.